About the time my oldest child turned 14, I realized that I was going to have to really crack down on our homeschooling. No more fun and games for me. But I will tell you that I had this realization that even though I needed to really focus on high school, I still had toddlers and babies and preschoolers and elementary school age kids and middle schoolers, and I was going to have to really stretch myself thin to make this work. So that's what this podcast is all about today, is how I managed to do that, how I continue to do that, and how you can manage to homeschool your high schooler with little kids as well. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Raising Arrows podcast. I'm Amy Roberts from raisingarrows.net, and this is episode number 179, Homeschooling High School with Babies and Toddlers Underfoot. This is actually a podcast that was requested by a listener, and I wanted to share, first of all, that I do have a post on the blog called Homeschooling High School in a Large Family that you can check out. I'll have the link posted in the description. She wanted me to talk about what it was like and what I did to homeschool high schoolers when I still had little kids at home. So this podcast is going to touch on a few different things. How I focused on my high schoolers, as well as how I occupied my little kids and how I managed to span the ages. And in order to not make this an incredibly long podcast, I am going to refer to some other podcasts and posts that I have on my blog that will help kind of fill in the blanks of this. But as I said at the top of the show, it was when my oldest son, who is now 27, turned 14. I had this sudden realization that his homeschool years were quickly coming to an end. And all of those wonderful topics and conversations and the fun curricula and all those things we'd used over the years was going to need to culminate into something tangible, like a diploma and a transcript and a purpose for his adult life. And so I was really feeling stressed about how we ended up at this place 10 years after I started homeschooling him. I think when I started, I just couldn't think that far ahead. And now that I was suddenly there, and it seemed like it was such a short time, I was suddenly there, and I knew I had to do something to make this all cohesive. But beyond that, I was also going to have to learn how to balance these younger kids with this more focused, serious, if you will, homeschooling effort of homeschooling a high schooler. Fast forward several years, and I now have 5 children left in my homeschool, and there are no more babies and toddlers underfoot, but my oldest in our homeschool is 16, and then the next oldest is 14. And so once again, and this happens over and over when you have a large family, once again, I am refocusing my efforts and realizing I have limited time with these 2 older boys, and I need to focus their studies on graduating them, prepping them for college, and making sure that they get the education that they need, while at the same time continuing to teach my little kids to read and elementary math and all of those things, and not lose the joy in my homeschool at the same time. With every single child you have, as you get to that high school age, you start to feel yourself revving up and needing to refocus and needing to buckle down, if you will. This isn't a one and done thing. Every single time you will feel this way, and you will realize your time is limited, and you'll feel a little torn because you have them to focus on with high school, but you also still have younger kids to focus on until you get to the last one. Until you get to the last few where everybody's in high school or they're much older and you don't have quite that pull anymore. But currently I still have this going on. Like I said, I still have these older kids, and my youngest is 8. And so I have to balance my time between the elementary school aged kids and the middle school and high schoolers. For some of you, like me, you are at this stage in your life for the very first time, and you are realizing you have maybe a baby in arms or toddlers running around, and you still have to figure out how to buckle down and figure out this high school homeschooling bit, and you're not sure how you're going to manage being serious about your homeschooling, because you were never serious before. That's not what I'm saying. But you feel like you need to be uber serious now because this is high school. Yet you still have these little kids that you're trying to occupy and entertain and, yes, even sometime educate. It's a really difficult place to be, and it can be very mind-boggling to even try to sit and think about it. So I want to kind of unravel all of this and lay it out for you and start by saying our family is proof positive that you can homeschool the high school years with little kids underfoot. So put that in the back of your mind that you actually can do this. I've done it now 4 times. You can do it too. That said, the things I'm going to share with you and the way that we've done some of this stuff is unique to us. I say this over and over again in this podcast. Those of you who are regular listeners know this is something I harp on. Your family is individual, unique circumstances. You need to respect that. What works for my family may not work for your family. We're just sharing ideas here, but you do need to focus on what's going to work for your family. Certainly try some of these things. Try on different ways and different approaches to high school and elementary and all of that, but do what works for your family. Interestingly, now that I've graduated 4 children, what worked for my older 2 did not work so well for my next 2. I had to change some things up, and we'll talk about that as we go along in this podcast as well. This is always a learning process. That's why I said it wasn't a one and done. I have to do this over and over and over, and you have to sometimes change gears in the middle of high school and try to figure out, okay, well, what's next? It is a constant learning process. You have to be willing to shift and change as needed and pay attention to the individual circumstances and needs. Okay, let's dive into this. The very first thing is to recognize that if God has called you to this, homeschooling high schoolers and having little kids, He is going to equip you for it. And that does not mean you're going to feel like you've got this in the bag. You know exactly what you're doing. In fact, you're probably going to feel completely inadequate for the task of homeschooling your high school with little ones underfoot. That's okay. God is enough. You don't have to be enough because God is enough. He's going to place the resources and the stamina that you need in your life to keep going and to finish strong. So find some peace in the decisions that you make as you go, and find some stability in your path through the simple understanding that God's got this. You may have to do a little bit of searching for some classes that you feel like your child needs. You might have to let go of some expectations that you realize were just arbitrary and didn't even make sense for your family or your child. You may have to search out resources or try something different. You also are definitely going to want to include your child in the conversation about their high school years, and we'll talk more about that as well. But ultimately, it's going to be okay. If God has called you to this, He's going to equip you for this. Now, there are a lot of people who make the decision to send their child to a public or private institution once they get to the high school years because they do feel inadequate, or they do feel like that is something that their family's being called to do. I am not here to say one way or the other whether that's a good choice or not because it's an individualized choice. For our family, it didn't make sense. It was something that we needed to just ignore and go on with the program that we were doing, and I feel like we made the right decision. God gave me the time and energy and resources to do what I needed to do for high school while I still had little kids at home. But if you are feeling so inadequate that you feel like you need to send your kids to public high school or private high school, I want you to take a step back and pray through it. Because sometimes it's just an emotional response. It's a feeling of inadequacy where you're trying to be everything, and you need to recognize that God is everything. You are not. Perhaps He's trying to stretch and grow you through this experience. Maybe not, but I want you to take some time to reflect and pray. I don't want this to be a knee-jerk reaction for you where you get your kids to the high school level and you think, okay, I need to send them to school because I don't think I can do this. There are so many resources out there now that you absolutely can do this. So don't let this be a knee-jerk reaction. Give yourself some time and space to make that decision. In fact, I'd encourage you to take this entire summer that's coming up and just really give yourself the time and space to pray through this and decide for sure if you need to send them to a government institution or a private school, or if you can find a way to keep them home and teach them from home, where the influences and all of the extras that come with sending them to a public or private school is not there. You have less of that influence and you have more time to cultivate who they're going to be and what they're going to need to know without all the extra interference and distractions. Not to say that there's not still going to be some interference and distractions. Homeschoolers have that as well. It's just not quite the bombardment that it is in a public institution. The next thing that is going to be essential for you as you are homeschooling high schoolers with little ones that you still need to focus on is to train toward independence. This is something I have talked about a lot. I have a podcast and I have a post on how to put your homeschool on autopilot and also independent school subjects and how to help your kids learn how to homeschool themselves. So I'll have those in the description for you. But basically, you want your kids to learn how to work independently and make independent decisions. That is just part of the maturing process. It's going from complete hand-holding to starting to let go, to fully letting them have some control of the choices that they're making. You start small when they're little with clothing and snack choices. And then from there, you teach them to work on their math without you standing over them. And you're just slowly helping them to gain the confidence in their own abilities to figure things out. And the older your children are, the more homeschool subjects they ought to have that are completely on autopilot and done completely independently without you hovering. That will give you some of that time back. So you may have to be serious about the focus and the subjects and the assignments for your high schooler, but the actual diligence in getting them to do their work should kind of have been taken care of clear back when they were 8, 9, 10 years old because you were slowly teaching them how to work on their own. Now, if you didn't do that, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to those podcasts and read those posts and learn how to do that so that you can start working on that because your high schooler is going to need to know how to work on their own. They're going to need to know how to have the motivation within themselves to work on their own. This is going to be an important skill as an adult. To give you an idea of what my current 16-year-old's day looks like, we get together for morning time. I'll be talking about that next. And then his independent school subjects are things like math, Bible, literature. He has a web design class. He's taking typing. He also has biology on his own. And he's taking a grammar for writers class from Compass Classroom. So as you can see, he has a pretty big workload as a high schooler. And a lot of that is on his own. In our homeschool, our kids have kind of broken down the subjects by morning time, paper school, and computer school. And my 16-year-old has a pretty good mix of what my kids would call paper school and computer school. And obviously he does have morning time with us as well, but he has a pretty big workload, and much of that does not require me in any way, shape, or form. I simply have handed him the next subject, shown him how to access it on the computer, and then let him go. And he is required to figure these things out for himself. The 14-year-old is learning. He struggles with some of the literature assignments at this point because while he can read well, he doesn't particularly enjoy it. And so I sometimes have to be on him about, hey, are you getting your literature done? Are you reading in your Bible? And he is working on his autopilot routine, which I mentioned I have a post on that, how to teach your children to put their subjects into autopilot. I also have an entire homeschool schedule course that you can take that will help you learn how to autopilot your subjects, the children's subjects, and make your entire homeschool day work for you rather than against you. So definitely check that out. I will have that in the description as well. So yes, my 16-year-old's day, he starts out sometimes before morning time doing some of his work, often his computer school. We do morning time together. He finishes up his day with his paperwork. He is learning to be focused and independent, and that is incredibly important for your high schoolers to know how to do. So start working toward that independent schoolwork, independently educating themselves with their own personal motivation, rewards, whatever it is you have to do to help them learn how to do those things on their own so that you have time with your younger kids that is not being eaten up by constantly hovering over a 16-year-old. The next thing has to do with our morning time, and that is anchoring your school day. Something I have found to be integral to getting everyone off on the right foot for the homeschool day is creating a starting point. It sort of anchors the day down, and then we can start from there. It tells everyone's brains that school has begun. And for us, that anchor point is morning time. That's when we do our Bible and our history and our art and music and our read aloud. And yes, my high schoolers participate in that. Some people feel like morning time is beneath their high schoolers. I just do not believe that. When I was in the thick of baby after baby, our morning time was super simple. It was just Bible time and then maybe a chapter in our read aloud if I could manage that or I didn't fall asleep in the middle of it. It was very, very simple, but it was still an anchor. It was still a starting point. Now I have a much more robust morning time, but it still is an important start to our homeschool day. It's a consistent start to our homeschool day. Even though my high schooler starts some of his work before morning time, it still is a part of his day where I'm sharing some of this education with him. We're still participating in this together. And I will tell you, reading aloud to your children, no matter what their age, is incredibly important to their development. It is incredibly important for them to hear sentences formed, words spoken correctly, stories put together fluently. It is incredibly important. So if you don't feel comfortable reading to your children aloud, maybe put on an audio book so that they can hear those words and enjoy that time together. And it's kind of even a little bit of a break for them where mom is doing the teaching and they are sitting there and participating, but not having to extract the information all by themselves like they do in their independent schoolwork. This is also a time when the entire family comes together. So I have the little ones there, and I have the big ones there, and I have all the in-between ones there. And we're doing life and homeschool together. It keeps us engaged as a family, and it helps my kids to know that I still enjoy homeschooling them, whether they're 5 or 15. If you check the description of this podcast, you'll find a bunch of links to some of these things that I've been mentioning, the morning time, the read aloud, the anchoring. I have lots and lots of resources on that on the blog. So like I said, this podcast is already getting exponentially longer than I would like it to be. So I'm going to fill in some of those blanks with those posts and podcasts. So just check the description for more information on these things. The next thing I want you to do is ask yourself if there is actually a routine to your day. So your anchor starts the day, but then do you know where everyone goes from there? Having a routine is going to help keep everyone on track, including yourself. It's basically the guide that your older kids need in order to get through their independent work in a particular order and then know where a stopping point is. There have been times when I have told my high schoolers in particular, I don't want them doing math for hours on end. I want them to know there's a stopping point. And if it looks like their math is going to go past like an hour or even 45 minutes, I want them to stop, cut their lesson in half, and come back to it tomorrow. I do not want them to just endlessly belaboring over an individual subject. They need to keep going with it. And sometimes you just need to take a step back from a concept and come back to it tomorrow. And so giving them this routine and this guidance and this stopping point to their day is super important, especially for high schoolers. It also helps them to be more independent because they know where the parameters are. It's basically like they know where the fence is and they're not going to go past the fence, but they can move all around within that fence. And that's really, really good for high schoolers because you don't want to quite open the gate just yet, but you want them to be able to mill around inside a nice boundary that gives them lots of room to breathe, helps them to make some choices on their own. But they need to have that boundary of, listen, school is done at this time of day. Don't go past that. Don't keep doing math endlessly. Don't sit up there in front of that computer for hours on end trying to get through your schoolwork. Here's the parameters. Stop when you need to. And that gives them some really defined goals and guidance for their day. If you're curious how many hours you should be homeschooling during the day, dependent on the age and stage of your child, I do have a post and podcast about how many hours it takes to homeschool. And as with everything, that will be posted down in the description. Now, one thing about high schoolers that can very easily happen is you can either let them go 100% on their own and then forget about them, or you can be so micromanaging that they feel overwhelmed. There is really a balance that has to be struck here. And so what I'd encourage you to do is give them as much independence as you can, but continue to check in with them. You need to touch base with them to make sure they're on the right track. Make sure that they are not feeling overwhelmed by the workload. They're not confused on certain subjects. And this is very dependent on the child. Some children are extremely vocal about how they're feeling, how they're doing in school. And then some children hide. And that's just the sheer fact of the matter. My fourth child, he would get confused and he would just quit. And he wouldn't tell me that he had quit. So checking in with him was how I managed to find out that he had quit doing his science one time. And one time he'd quit doing his math. And I was like, okay, we got to reboot this and figure out what's going on. And come to find out, he'd gotten confused on one concept and he'd just quit. And so we had a time where we could have some character lessons. We could work through that. We could rework things and try to figure out something that would work better for him. And one thing that we realized was he needed to go to an auditory science. Rather than trying to wade through the science in the textbook, he needed to listen to the textbook. So easy fix. We got the textbook on audio and he breezed through it and understood it. And we kept going. But if you're not checking in with your high schooler, you may realize at the end of their high school years, they're not as far as you thought they were going to be. So don't drop the ball in that way. Keep checking in with them. Adjust accordingly. Listen to them and let them know that you actually value their opinion. That may be one reason that they aren't sharing with you, is that they're afraid that it's just not going to matter. So help them to understand that it does matter how they feel about the work, how they're progressing in the work, whether or not they enjoy the lessons or the subject that they're learning. But do remember, you are the parent. And kids learn from a very early age how to manipulate. And I'm actually convinced that human beings never stop trying to get their own way. It's like innate in us. We are constantly trying to get our own way. So while you are listening to your high schooler, ultimately you are the authority in their homeschool. They are always going to have authorities in their lives. And if you just always cave to whatever they want, you're not teaching them that very valuable lesson that they aren't always the authority. And sometimes they aren't going to like what the authorities have them do. They don't have to like it. Do try to give them reasons for why you are continuing a certain subject or why you're having them do things a certain way. Give them whatever autonomy you can, but don't compromise what you know to be important in their lives. I do have some posts and podcasts about homeschool graduation requirements and what I think children ought to know before they graduate high school. And again, it's very subjective because it may be different for your home and homeschool, but ultimately, you need to have an idea of what these high school years are going to look like and then implement that plan and listen to your high schooler, but don't compromise what you feel like is most important. And then finally, something near and dear to my heart is the fact that you are raising arrows, not children. They need to grow up and be shot out of the nest someday. And so they need to have an understanding of the adult world and the interests that coincide with adult life. So while you are raising babies and toddlers and younger children, you need to start changing how you see your older children. You honestly can't hang on to your kids forever. I am realizing that very difficult lesson right now. You have to let them learn to fly. And sometimes that might mean they're going to fail as well. Too many parents have handheld their kids well past their teenage years, and that doesn't do anyone any favors. You need to prepare your high schoolers as best as you can, and then you need to learn to see them as young adults and eventually adults. You need to let them go. And this is a slow process that is best done in those high school years. It's not easy for mom, it's not easy for dad, and it's definitely not easy for your high schooler, but it's necessary. And I think that's the beauty of having little ones underfoot, is that you still have some focus that needs to be taken away from the high schooler. And so there's this natural, like, you need to grow up while I'm focusing on these younger kids. Our society and culture tends to tell us, like, we have got to focus on our children till they're well into their 20s and we have to do everything for them, and they're not adults, they're children until they're 25 years old. And I just think that is such a disservice to our children. I think it's super important that we believe in them, we help them to fly, but we let them go and let them try and let them fail and be there to hug them and pick them back up when they do fail, but not to just hand everything to them and not to just smooth the way for them. Certainly, we don't want things to be hard. We want them to learn from our mistakes, but they also have to make mistakes as well. Now, if you are looking for specific things to do with your younger kids while you're homeschooling, I do have that podcast on occupying a busy preschooler, and I have some posts on that as well. We used to use what I called a toddler box, where there was a special box that we only got out at school time for the toddler to play with. I've got a lot of tips and tricks like that, but really I feel like the focus of this podcast is the high school years, that you're a little freaked out about teaching high school. You've got these younger kids and you're just not sure how to balance it. And really, my biggest takeaway from this is that your older kids need to be independent enough that you can sort of let them go so that you can still continue to focus on your younger kids. I will tell you a really quick story to end this podcast, and that is that as my older kids were growing up in the homeschool and we were teaching them and we were going through all this great material, I was, educating them and I was learning alongside them. I got to a place where I realized I had grown up with my older kids and left my little kids behind. I was not doing the fun things that I had done with my older kids because I was growing up with them and I was doing all this older kids stuff. And so there came a point several years ago where I started over and I did preschool with all my younger kids, even though some of them were definitely not preschoolers. We did a preschool program. We participated together. We've done lots of fun projects since then. And I allowed myself to let my high schoolers do high school things while I sort of went back and turned the clock back and started over with my little people. It seems like we're constantly having to reassess where we are as mothers of large families. Are we up there with the high schoolers and we've ignored the little ones? Are we still down there with the little ones and we've ignored the older ones? There's a lot to this job, and I don't want you to ever stop learning and growing and changing and adapting and fixing things and having conversations, because it is such a beautiful thing to watch this large family of mine, turn into a bunch of older kids, and how wonderful my relationship is with them while I still have these little kids that I'm nurturing and cuddling. And it's just such an enjoyable journey that if you don't take a step back and look at it and reassess here and there, you're going to miss some things that are really a beautiful part of being a large family mom and of being a homeschool mom. Again, you can totally do this. I have done this 4 times. I have graduated 4 children from our homeschool. I am well into halfway through graduating the next one. You can do it. Absolutely, you can do it. It's going to take some time and energy and adjusting and readjusting, but you can do it. It's not going to be perfect, but in the end, it's going to be a story and a journey all its own. Don't miss the enjoyment of that journey. If you are looking for more help with homeschooling your large family, I have a fantastic book called Large Family Homeschooling. It is full of ideas for homeschooling with newborns and preschoolers and homeschooling high school and on and on. There's just so much meat in that book. I'd encourage you to get that book. I'll have it linked down in the description for you. And until next time, friends, may you be blessed on this journey of homeschooling and making a home for your large family.